Welcome to Dear Social Worker, Let's Talk, the podcast that prioritizes you, the person behind the title. I'm your host, Lisa Rann, and I'm here to help you become an emotionally intelligent social worker and promote your well-being at socialworkcoachinghub.com. Welcome to another episode raising awareness of Black History Month here in the UK. And today's podcast is titled Working with Black Families. And I have two special guests today. I have a co-founder of Replenish Culture, and we have Joe Mairura, founder and director of Imara Development Programs Limited. He's an independent social worker and leadership coach and mentor. So let's talk. James, welcome to the Dear Social Worker podcast.
Thank you, Lisa Ann. It's amazing to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Joe, welcome to the Dear Social Worker podcast.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
I'm so excited to speak to you both because this is a topic that I know is close to all of our hearts, and we all have experiences of working with Black children and Black families. And I think it's key for our listeners to listen to other social workers' experiences of that, but also to hear about some of the services that are available to support you as social workers. So I'm going to come to you first, James, and I would love to hear your take on what inspired you to be part of this particular discussion.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an honor to be part of this particular discussion. I think this discussion is at the heart of good social work practice. I think for me, good social work practice addresses inequality proactively, and I think that developing our cultural competence is something that we should all be absolutely committed to as individual social workers and as a profession collectively. And I think it's quite timely that we're having it in Black History Season here in the UK.
Thank you, James. Joe?
I think talking about working with Black children or with Black families is really important because it's at the very core of social work that needs to work with the individual as they find them in their environment, in their life situation, in their circumstances. And nothing could be more important than that. And I think that's what we mean in social work when we talk about working with a person holistically. And in the context of Black families, being holistic exactly about engaging with them and working with them as a Black family.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm going to jump straight into this because you've both alluded to the concept of cultural competence. And I'd love to hear your take, James, on what do we mean when we use the term cultural competence? And also, what do we mean when we use the term cultural humility?
Yeah, it's a great question. My interpretation of this topic really is cultural competence is about the ability to sort of recognize and respect different cultures and actually having the humility to be able to learn and to kind of see them all as equal. I think that typically in the Western world, we tend to view things through quite a sort of Eurocentric lens. And it's kind of like, well, this is the sort of top standard and everything else is kind of below that. And just to give you an example, I come from, born in London to Sierra Leonean parents. To anyone who doesn't know, Sierra Leone's in West Africa, and growing up, my mum would kind of tie me, like wrap me and put me on her back, as a baby and as a toddler. And we always talk about this because that was a practice that I think in the UK was quite frowned upon. But actually, as years have gone by, we've realized the importance of skin-to-skin contact, of, the mother and the child being very close. And so it's not seen, it's not looked at in that kind of deficit way. It's seen as actually this is a bit different, but it's good and it's a different cultural practice. So I think for me, it's about actually having that appreciation and having that curiosity about different ways that families do things. whether that's how they sort of bring up babies and infants, or whether that's how they do their family rituals. It's about having that appreciation that actually the Western ideal is not the only ideal, is not necessarily the best ideal. There's different ways of doing things. And I think this is very important for social workers when working with Black families.
Thank you, James. It's really insightful, and I would think this was a perfect time for you to share more about replenish culture and what that means to you and why you became a co-founder.
Absolutely. So Replenish Culture is it's an award-winning initiative. It's was sort of started by myself and a foster carer, and this was really sparked by the kind of historical issue in the care system around hair care and skin care for Black children in care, and what I could only describe as a gap. Um, I would meet very well-meaning foster carers who were doing amazing work, but I guess through their lack of cultural competence, they were maybe not so aware around how to care for Afro hair textures, how to moisturize Black skin, and so that would mean that a key fundamental aspect of that child's identity was not being catered to correctly. So I was fostering team manager at the time, and Sarah, my co-founder, was one of our amazing foster carers. And we had many conversations where we were kind of just putting the world to rights, talking about the foster care system as a whole, speaking about Blackness, speaking about race and identity. And we decided to do something. We were moved to do something. And so Sarah came up with quite a genius idea of, why don't we put some products inside a box? So let's put some combs, let's put some brushes, some skin moisturizers, some hair moisturizers, put them inside a box and make them available for foster carers and for children in care. And I came up with the name Replenish because for me, it's about pouring into yourself. It's about pouring into our young people, supporting them with self-care, supporting them around their identity, and recognizing that actually Black children need something different. It's not about giving them more. It's not about additional things. It's about, as Black people, there's certain rituals we have. And one of them is around creaming our skin, moisturizing our skin. It's about caring for our hair. And if you are looking after a Black child, it's quite important that your cultural competence extends to understanding this aspect. And so that's really where Replenish Culture was born. And so, we kind of produce the boxes and we make them available to local authorities, fostering agencies, schools, any setting where there may be children, particularly Black children.
Thank you very much, James. Joe, I'm going to come to you. I'd love for you to tell us more about cultural humility.
I think first of all is kudos and respect to you, James, for what you're doing. I think the concept of a box is really quite innovative and essential, I would say. In some quarters might be innovative. As far as I'm concerned, it's really being sensitive to the person you're working to. So down to cultural competence and humility. You kind of took the words out of my mouth, but hopefully I'll try and kind of put this in a slightly different way, but I suppose saying the same thing. Cultural competence. I think the secret is in the word competence. It's the humility, to use your word, and the openness to the fact that actually you may need and should work with each individual person, service user, foster carer, or in my case in adult care, work with an openness to be prepared to work with the family you have got in front of you in a way that doesn't necessarily fall within what you're used to. And that's why I'm emphasizing the word openness. That is the competence. For me, the competence is actually saying, understand that actually you may not know, and if you don't know, and then you ask. That's the humility bit. And that translates in very practical terms, as you said. It's actually, you know, how how do you, what do you do in the morning when you wake up? Some people pray, some people don't. Some people have got rituals, as you rightly say. We all have got our rituals, actually. I have to be cultural competent if I'm working with somebody who's not black. Therefore, I take the trouble to understand who they are, to understand even the fact that where they come from. For instance, I'm married to a white woman from Liverpool, and therefore that's part of her culture. It comes from an Irish Liverpool family, and therefore I've got to appreciate her background, her experience, her identity, and I expect, and actually I'll even go further to say, actually, I demand that actually as a social worker, you need and you must um, um, respect and be prepared to be humble enough to ask so you can respond appropriately. That is the humility bit. If I can give my own practical experience, I mean, as I say, I'm married to a white woman, and it's interesting, the hair care bit. And that was the first thing that actually came up in our family, how we're going to look at our children's hair. And she was humble enough to ask me and humble enough to listen to the advice she got. So she actually went to a local college and actually learned how to do black hair. Because these were children who were mixed culture children, and their hair was different. It was different. It wasn't substandard. It wasn't inferior. It was just different, and therefore needed different care. So if I may use the word humility and the competence, her competence was actually to say, I don't know how to do this. Therefore, I am going to be humble enough to go and learn how to do it so that actually my children's hair can look good and healthy and whatever. And it was also part of giving them their identity. I don't know if that helps, because I think that's really, I mean, we talk about co-creation and co-production. There is, cultural competence is at the very core of co-production, really, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Joe. That's really helpful. And it's insightful to hear about your background and how your wife sought that support and actually said, I'm going to learn about this. And I think that is a great example of cultural humility. And if we're to transfer that to social work practice, James, what advice would you give to social workers or indeed professionals working with Black children in care?
One of the first things I would like to say is keep an open mind, and don't take anything for granted. So, there's many versions of blackness. Okay, so I think one of the things I always say in this work is, black people are not a monolith. As a kind of British-born West African black man, my version of blackness could differ from a British-born Caribbean, or there's many versions of blackness. So I think it's always dealing with the person in front of you, and like Joe said, I really love that it's a co-production. I think that we have to position ourselves in a place of listening to learn rather than listening to respond. How do we invite the person we're working with to actually reveal some aspects of themselves? And how do we receive that in a non-judgmental way, if even it seems different to our norms, our sort of our cultural norms, our understanding of how things should be done? And I think this is a very complex thing in social work, because many times we're in the position of being an expert, being the person that signposts to different services, being the person that tells a family about how to parent sufficiently. But there are some aspects of this conversation where actually we're not the expert, and we need to be in that position where we can learn and receive that information, and understand really authentically the family or the client that you're working with. So we keep on mentioning this word humility, and it can seem like a cliche term at times, but I think in its essence, I think for me, humility is about being open to being taught and not taking things for granted.
Mm. Really wise words there, James. And I think the word that sums it up is one of the first words that you said, openness. The openness and willingness, the professional curiosity to learn more about the family you're working with or the child specifically. And what just came up for me there was around placements and how it's key around matching placements. James, I'm going to come back to you about that because I'm sure with your fostering experience, you have some stories to tell and some advice to give around matching children with the right type of carer. And in the instances, perhaps, where a Black child cannot be placed with a Black carer, what are the considerations that should be taken then?
Absolutely, and this is something that should be, a discussion point all throughout the year, because Black children are overrepresented in the care system, and that shows no signs of changing. So, yeah, best practice, we would always want to culturally match, so when we have children coming into the care system and we're identifying a foster carer for them, can we find a foster carer from their same cultural background? It's not always possible, because we've got big issues in the sort of fostering world at the moment in trying to recruit enough foster carers to support the level of demand for placements. So then it's about, well, what do we need to be considering? So if we have a white British family receiving siblings from Congo, let's say, what do we need to be thinking about? Where do we need to support that foster carer? So hair and skin care is one of the obvious areas where we can provide support, and
Yeah,
I'm going to plug Replenish Culture again at this point.
absolutely.
But also, what are the other aspects of Blackness? We know that our children are adultified. Okay, so having cultural competence for me is being aware of, okay, as a parent, as a corporate parent, how do I understand this journey, this child's journey, and the way this child navigates the world, and some of the barriers this child may face, um, systemically? So when we look at school, we know that Black children at times are more likely to be permanently excluded. So what type of advocacy do we need in that setting? Do we need to upskill the foster carer in that space? Also thinking about food. I believe this should be quite a straightforward thing now, because we've got Uber Eats and we've got Deliveroo and we've got Google's your friend and YouTube is your friend, right? So there's
Yeah.
so many resources and information is available at our fingertips now. But what I would see sometimes in the fostering team was, I think foster carers didn't always appreciate the importance of doing that, because when you've been in a role a long time, you can become complacent. And this is where I go back to my earlier point around not taking anything for granted, and Blackness not being a single story. So how do we invite the child in to share with us their version of Blackness? I think this is very important. And then last thing I want to say, given we're in Black History season,
Thank you, James. That leads to my next question for Joe, which is exploring how social workers can find out the varying cultures of Black families. Because what you're rightly pointing out there, James, is there, and we've talked about this on all episodes this Black History Month, is that there is a separation between ethnicity and culture. And I think it's key that social workers are given some advice and some insight into identifying more specifically, Joe, the cultures of Black children and Black families that they're working with. How can they find out more about that so they create a plan which is reflective of their culture?
I'll give you my own example. I came to the UK in 1980, just after 1981, just after the Brixton riots. And my experience as somebody born, bred, grew up, my first education was done in Kenya, in East Africa. My experience as a Kenyan person, I wasn't a social worker then. I was a teacher, and then I learned in London, and there's all these other people, and yes, I could see I shared their color, but actually the very fact I ended up in East London, for instance, and the accent was different. That caught my attention straight away. And it wasn't about judging. It was very quickly kind of adjusting the point that actually just because this person is black doesn't mean we share the same experience. Give you a very practical example. I was born in Kenya. If I crossed the border to go into Tanzania, I had to be aware of the fact that actually they didn't speak the same language, although we both spoke Kiswahili. There were different types of languages. And it's the humility to be open to always learning. A piece of advice that my granddad said to me, which I've never forgotten, that I've always used in my practice, and that is, I can almost hear him saying this to me as I'm speaking to you. You know, Joseph, and whenever my granddad says Joseph, I knew there was something important coming. And it was, Joseph, always be prepared to learn. Because you don't know everything. And that has been at the core of my practice, whether it's in teaching, whether it's been in nursing or in social work or as a senior manager. It was the preparedness to be open. And yes, when working with other black families, I need to be, like Jamie said, you know, their families coming from Congo, they may have a Belgian experience or a French experience, and here's me coming from Kenya with the British colonial background. Just that bit in itself is something that I've got to keep in mind and advise a social worker to be aware of that. And that in itself actually brought it home to me. It's a process of being prepared, what I call to unlearn, learn.
I hear you, Joe, and I thank you for sharing those stories and, you know, reminding social workers to remain curious.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a more specific question to you here, because there'll be social workers out there trying to understand what we may mean about the difference between ethnicity and culture, and the fact that there are several cultures within one race, right?
Yeah.
How can they be curious about that practically while out there on the front line?
So ethnicity is what identifies you in terms of your skin or where you were born or whatever. Culture, I see culture as the experience of day-to-day living. So that's the rituals, that's the music, that's the food, that's the language. That's what kind of counts as culture. And as a social worker, it is being aware of the fact that actually, yes, we know the black people share black skin, but actually it's actually what are their norms, you know.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying there, Joe, is also linked to a social worker having the confidence to ask those questions.
Yes.
And being clear on the reason why you're asking those questions. So if you are challenged when you're out there on the front line, listeners, you've got the justification. We are approaching the end, but before we go, every guest always leaves a note. It's like a verbal note for social workers, and it always starts with "Dear social worker." And as you're thinking of what you're going to say, I want to remind all of the listeners about interacting with our Spotify questions. So next to each episode, we have some questions, and you can get involved with the poll, get involved with the questions, give us feedback, let us know what else you want us to talk about. There's also a button you can click which asks you to record a voice message. In light of that, I'm going to ask Joe to start with a letter to social worker, and you can start this how you like, Joe, but it will be a tall glass of joy for whoever listens to it. Joe, over to you.
Dear social worker and my fellow professional, first and foremost, being a member of this profession is a privilege. And I do mean that from the bottom of my heart. And what I'd really share with you is be curious, be absolutely open to different experiences, be prepared to learn, be open, be joyful about discovery, be joyful about getting to know different people, different things, different ways of working, and above all, you are powerful and you're privileged, and use your power. Use your power to work the best way you can and support and advocate for the child or for the family that you work with. That's both a duty and a privilege. See your practice as an opportunity, a daily opportunity to learn. And I wish you the very best, and I'm sure you will be okay if you take that opportunity. It's unlearn, relearn, and then learn again.
Dear social worker, continue to do the fantastic work you do. I'm aware you're not always recognized and fully appreciated for the work you do, but continue to celebrate the small wins, continue to celebrate the impact you make, continue to go forward with hope, with optimism, and with spirit. Dear social workers working with Black families, please continue to celebrate Black identity. Please continue to focus on the positives and keep up the brilliant work you're doing.
You've been listening to Dear Social Worker Let's Talk podcast. I want to give a massive thanks to Joe and James for being part of this worthy episode. We will be back with the last installment for Black History Month. Don't forget, social workers, you are not alone. Visit socialworkcoachinghub.com to get in contact with me and access any of the resources that are linked to the hub. You've been listening to Lisa Rann, and I will see you all next week. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, James.
You're welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.